So we'll get started. I'll pop off of the webcam just so you have the full view of the slides, but I'll come back on in the end. So I'll just do that now. And I'll pop over here. So here we go. So I'll just take us through the overview of what we'll cover today. So I'll start off talking about what's new for our current grant year, because things do change from year to year, so ever so slightly. We'll talk then about the kind of program essentials, what the program is about, and then we'll talk through eligibility criteria related to the organization, programs, and our financial eligibility. Then we'll talk about spending the grant and grant spending rules and timelines and things like that. We'll talk about applying for the grant and some of the timeframes for the different sectors. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the capital project grant stream, which is also open right now and will be until the end of this month. And finally, I'll leave off with some resources where you can get in touch, and also links to our website and things like that. So let's get going. Before we begin, I'll just wanted to do a territorial acknowledgement. So I'm speaking to you today from Victoria, which is the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. We're probably tuning in from all different locations around BC, so I'll just invite you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands that you're currently viewing the presentation from. Okay, so let's get into what is new for 2020-2021. Obviously, the biggest factor in everyone's life over the past year and a half or so has been COVID-19. The not-for-profit sector has been doing a wonderful job of continuing to provide programming and services throughout this really challenging time, and we wanted to be able to support that. We heard from organizations very early on and have continued to about how they've had to modify their programs or cancel or postpone, and also the very challenging financial situation that organizations have found themselves in. So in response to what we heard last year, early in the spring, we adapted some of our program policies and procedures, and we've continued a lot of these for the current grant year, and we've kind of built them into our guidelines. So we've been able to relax and adapt several of our program criteria to provide flexibility and make sure that organizations could continue to be eligible for grant funding. So specifically, some of the things that we're doing is that we have opened the human and social services sector early again this year. So it's been open since the start of June, and that was just to keep continuity with what we had done last year, so organizations didn't have to wait more than 12 months to apply again. We've also relaxed the operating surplus criteria for return applicants, just noting that cash flow management has been really difficult because of postponed programming, and also a lot of organizations have received temporary government aid. And we've also relaxed the 75% government funding limit for programs. Again, just noting that the community and volunteer involvement has been impacted, and there may be more government funding than usual. We've also relaxed the requirement for programs to have been delivered for 12 months previous to the submission of their application for return applicants. And we've also waived that 12-month requirement for new programs that specifically address community needs that arose in response to COVID-19. And we have one new temporary COVID-19 response measure for this year, and that is that gaming grant funding can be used to create new paid positions in 2021. And that's hopefully to help organizations retain the people that they need and increase their capacity, especially as they're getting their programs up and running again. In addition, we have some kind of more minor policy changes. We do update our guidelines every year in response to some of the input and feedback that we get during the previous year. And we get this from stakeholders, we get it from applicants, and even our own staff. So these updates kind of include things like policy changes or clarification or improvement to existing policy. And that's all with the intention of continuously improving our program and making it as easy to understand as it possibly can be. So some examples for this year that we did, we added a notification to applicants that publicly available materials and information about your organization or programming may be reviewed as part of the application assessment. We've also updated the organization eligibility criteria to just provide greater clarity on the organization membership requirements and additional information on the board of directors election and governance requirements. And we've also added a couple new subsectors for the sport and arts and culture sector just to better capture programming in these sectors. So it's kind of things like that that we've tweaked in addition to the bigger COVID-19 related measures. So the Community Gaming Grants Program Guidelines are our main policy document for our program. They contain all the information about our program, and they do have these new changes reflected for the year. We definitely encourage everyone, whether you've read it before or it's your first time, to read through these and make note of the details where you need to as you're preparing and submitting your application. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about the higher level kind of program essentials. So our program has $140 million that we give out annually. 135 of this is our community gaming grant program, and that is specifically to help nonprofits deliver their ongoing programs. And we have a separate $5 million capital project grant program, and that's to help nonprofits with capital projects or acquisitions that are a bit bigger in size. And all of this is funded through gaming revenues. So our program, the Community Gaming Grants Program, it's not a competitive grant process. So if an organization is eligible, they have eligible programs, they will receive some level of funding support, which generally means that over 90% of applicants will receive a grant. And last year, the average grant amount was around $28,000. So that, I think, really reflects all of the sort of local level programming that we support. And on average, we fund about 5,000 organizations every year across BC. So there are several organizations in many communities, but we like to think that it's pretty much across the entire province that our funding is helping organizations provide their programs. So obviously, nonprofits deliver many different kinds of programming in lots of different areas. So what our program has done is separated into 5 different funding sectors. And that just helps us to organize our intakes and notifications and track funding to different sectors. And also to help us specify the kinds of programs and services that we support under each sector. So I'll run through each to give you a sense of what each sector is about, because I anticipate that we probably have people from all the different sectors on the call today. So we have arts and culture. So this is really about programs that provide public access to and preservation of the arts, heritage, and culture. So this includes things like performing arts, performances, music education, art galleries, fairs and festivals, museums, and other cultural programs. We also have a sector for sport, and that is about community-based and amateur programs for organized competitive physical activity. So this would include all your kind of local youth and adult sport leagues for things like soccer, hockey, skating, swimming. It also includes Special Olympics as well as seniors games. We've got an environment sector, and that is really about programs that revitalize, protect, or provide education on ecosystems and the environment. So this could include things like ecosystem conservation, land stewardship, outdoor education, climate change adaptation, and also includes animal shelters and humane societies. We also have a public safety sector, and that's about programs that enhance and support public safety initiatives. Examples would be things like volunteer firefighting, search and rescue, outdoor recreation is included in this, as well as disaster relief and emergency preparedness. And we have our human and social services sector, which is our largest sector, as it includes quite a spectrum of programs and services, but they're all kind of similar in the fact that they contribute to the quality of life in a community or group. So this could include things like childcare, services for people with a disability, counseling, community building programs, seniors activities, as well as service clubs are funded through this stream. So that would be things like the Lions Club and things like that. And finally, we have a separate sector for parent advisory councils and district parent advisory councils. And that's about ensuring that we're providing funding to support the enhancement of extracurricular opportunities for students in the K-12 school system. And that's funded a little bit differently. It's done on a per student basis, where $20 per student is allocated to each PAC. So we have a few different funding levels depending on the size and scope of an organization and the programming that they provide. It starts at local organizations being able to apply for up to $100,000. Regional organizations can apply for up to $225,000. So that would be where they're serving several different communities, but maybe are more regional in focus. And finally, provincial organizations can apply for up to $250,000. That would be where there was kind of one entity that was responsible for providing that type of program or service in the entire province. So funding is awarded based on that size, scope, and community benefit that is demonstrated through the program description and through the demonstrated financial need as seen through the program financials that's provided, the budget, and that all provides information on the previous 12-month delivery. In addition, the funding request that's made by the organization is also a factor in how much a group would receive. First, obviously, in that we wouldn't award more than what an organization requests from us, but also organizations may ask for the maximum amount or even a larger ask, anticipating that they wouldn't receive the full amount. And organizations might be disappointed if they don't receive their full request, but always our advice is to ask for what you need, as demonstrated by your program financials and what it takes to run your program. And finally, we are a demand-driven program, and we do have a fixed budget. As I mentioned, we've got $135 million for the community gaming grants stream. So the amount of funding that we have available to disperse every year is really carefully managed to make sure that we can support all eligible organizations. So this means that funding levels aren't guaranteed from year to year, just depending on the demand on our program. So now I'll talk about organization eligibility. So as I mentioned, this is a program for nonprofits. So our first criteria for an organization is that they be a non-for-profit. They must deliver programs and services to the community. They must have an open membership, so anyone can come and join and be involved. They must have a volunteer board and voting membership. And that voting membership must be double the number of board members. So if you had a board that had 5 board members on it, your membership would need to be at least 11. So that would be more than double. The board must be democratically chosen by its members. and 2/3 must reside in BC. And like all nonprofits, board members are not remunerated for their role as a board member. On the other side of the coin, ineligible organizations, obviously, if you are a for-profit organization, this program would not be for you. Similarly, member-funded societies, which are essentially a specific type of nonprofit that is, the long story short, they kind of exist just to serve their own members, also would not be eligible. Political parties, political action groups, or lobby groups are also not eligible. And same goes for any type or level of government. Similarly, education institutions or schools or any provincially or municipally operated facility also would not be counted as an eligible organization. Okay, so now we'll talk a bit about the program eligibility. As I mentioned earlier, obviously there are a wide range of different types of programming, and we support all of those. And as such, we have the same program eligibility for all of our sectors. We do fund on a program basis, which means that we provide funding for the programs. And the way that we define a program is that it is an ongoing service, activity, or series of activities. So that means we don't fund one-time things or projects or something that's time limited. Again, the Community Gaming Grants program is focused on supporting programs that benefit the community, respond to a community's needs, and are accessible and open to all community members. And we fund programs that are already ongoing in a community. So programs must be delivered for at least 12 months before they would be eligible for grant funding. You may recall earlier I had said this is one of those criteria that we have relaxed for this year for return applicants or for programs that have been created specifically to address COVID-19 related needs. So just a little asterisk there. So eligible programs. I just mentioned the 12-month delivery requirement. The programs must be directly delivered by the applicant, so they couldn't be through some kind of intermediary. They must be ongoing, so they're not a project, and they must provide an immediate and direct service to the community. So it couldn't be an indirect benefit to the community. The program must be doing something directly with the community. And programs must be accessible and inclusive. So for us, that means that it's open to anyone and there are no unnecessary restrictions to being able to benefit from a program or service. So I'll give you an example of how to apply for a program. The first example is where the organization delivers one program or all activities kind of fall under one program and they're all related. So the example here, we've got the Sunshine Theatre Society, and they've got a program, which is their Sunshine Theatre program. So the program includes essentially all the programming that's delivered by the organization, and that would include things like their seasonal production costs, which could be things like rent, wages, materials, as well as any promotion or advertising. So everything that they do is kind of one and the same with their organization. Another example is where an organization might offer several different programs that are a bit discrete from each other. So an organization can apply for funding for each discrete program within the same community gaming grant application, but they need to be presented separately. So again, in this example, we've got the Sunshine Arts Council. It's got 3 different programs. The first program is a public art display and gallery program. It's got another program that's about a summer folk music festival. And then a third program, which is a youth art lessons and kids camps. So all of these are different from each other. They all have their different revenue streams and expenses. So they would be presented separately in an application. And so each of these would have their own program descriptions and program financials that captures what that whole program is about. So ineligible programs would be, you can probably guess, those that exclusively serve an organization's membership, meaning that programs are not reasonably open to the public. They would be programs that are about providing financial assistance to individuals. Any fundraising or social enterprise programs would not be eligible, nor would programs that are really just about operating a facility or a venue. Programs that deliver vocational training are not eligible, or any programs that are delivered on contract or under a funding agreement with another entity. Programs that primarily benefit other organizations rather than community members, not eligible. And finally, the underlying theme is that programs that don't deliver an immediate and direct service to the community would not be eligible, as this program is really, the emphasis is on the delivery of programming to individuals in a community. So as part of the application, organizations must submit a program description for each program that they're applying for. And this should be a summary of all the core information that someone would need in order to understand what your program is, what it's all about, what it is you do, things like how many people benefit and who it's intended to serve, when and how often it happens, where it takes place, and how the program reflects and meets the community needs. So those kind of key who, what, when, where, how questions. The program description is where you would tell us both the sort of quantitative and numerical kind of hard facts in terms of the, those who, what, wheres. But it's also where organizations can tell us the qualitative and sort of storytelling side, why your program is needed, the gap that it fills, why it's important to your community, and some of the great outcomes that it achieves. This is all part of the community benefit piece, and is also considered alongside those kind of hard statistical numbers. So before we move on, I just wanted to mention two other kinds of programming that the Community Gaming Grant funds that are slightly different from other organizations' programming. So earlier I mentioned that we do fund service clubs, so clubs like Elks, Kiwanis, Lions, and so on. They can apply for a community donations program where they're able to donate funds to other eligible organizations or to individuals or families for a one-time emergency. And they can also apply for funding to support their own programs in the community. And then I mentioned before too, we provide funding to parent advisory councils, and we do this on a rate of $20 per student for extracurricular activities. And they could, this helps them do things like playgrounds, they host theater groups, student publications or clubs, things like that. So everything that would be outside of the curriculum and is there to enhance that extracurricular activity in schools. So financial eligibility. We have financial eligibility criteria for both the organization as well as the program. So we'll talk about the organization piece first. So applicants must meet the specific organization financial eligibility criteria to be considered for a grant. And what we do is look at the organization level financial statements to determine whether the organization has a financial need. And that's because we want to ensure that grant funding is going toward organizations who can demonstrate a need for financial support. So to assess that, we request the following documents from organizations. So we're looking to see a revenue and expense statement for the previous fiscal year. So that would be the one that's most recently completed. Balance sheet for the same time period, as well as a budget for the current fiscal year, and any accompanying notes to the financial statements for the previous fiscal year. An organization would be temporarily ineligible to receive a grant if it earns more than $250,000 in its previous fiscal year through its own licensed gaming activities. So if they do things like 50-50 or raffles, If there's any conditions that cast doubt on its financial stability, so maybe they carry a significant deficit, that would be a concern. Or if an organization has more than 50% of its previous fiscal year's operating expenses on hand in unrestricted cash funds at the start of its current fiscal year. And that last one, again, is one of those criteria that we have relaxed for this current year for return applicants. So a little bit more on that last piece. We determine the financial need by assessing cash on hand that's proportionate to expenses. And we call this our surplus calculation. So how and why do we calculate the surplus calculation? So basically, we subtract any gaming funds, any liabilities or restricted funds from an organization's current cash assets, and we assess this against the organization's operating expenses to come up with a surplus percentage. So you'll see here there's a formula. Organizations do not need to do this calculation. This is something that the analyst does when they're reviewing the application, and it's based off of information that's provided in the organization's financial statements. It's just kind of here to let you know what that looks like. But I'll run through an example that hopefully will make sense of that. So say an organization's operating expenses are $200,000 and the organization has $150,000 in current cash assets, as well as $50,000 in gaming funds, liabilities, and restricted funds, kind of all grouped together. So that $50,000 would be subtracted from the $150,000 in current cash assets, which would leave a total net of $100,000 in current cash assets available to the organization. So we would take that current cash assets and divide it by the operating expenses. So in this case, it would be 100,000 divided by that 200,000 of operating expenses, which would indicate that the organization has a 50% surplus. And as I mentioned, this criteria is flexible for those who have been affected by COVID-19, where they may have, their expenses may have been down because they didn't deliver anything. And they may have quite a bit of cash assets sitting in the bank, so that surplus would be greater than 50%. Okay, so for program financial eligibility, applicants must also supply program financials to determine the program's financial eligibility, and as well as what it costs to run the program. So to assess that, we require a program revenue and expense statement for the previous fiscal year, again, the most recently completed year, and a program budget for the current fiscal year. And that's required for each program that the organization is applying for. So if you recall the earlier example, if you were applying for 3 different programs, we would require those program level financial statements for each of those programs. One of our main program financial criteria is that government funding cannot exceed 75% of the total program cost. And the main reason for this is to see that there's a demonstrated community support for the program. So applicants must have at least 25% of their program operating costs coming from non-government sources. And there's a whole bunch of ways that that can be demonstrated. So that could be through user fees, fundraising, in-kind contributions, and so on. And if government funding does exceed that 75% threshold, then funding may be limited or it may be denied. And again, this is one of those criteria that has been relaxed for return applicants who have been affected by COVID-19. And of course, all sources of program revenue must be clearly stated in the program financials in order to allow us to make that, that assessment. So I've mentioned several financial documents so far, so I'll just provide a summary. And then I think later I'm going to talk a little bit about the timing of when I talk about current and past fiscal year. So for the organization financials, as I mentioned, we're looking for the organization's balance sheet for the most recently completed fiscal year. We're also looking for the organization's revenue and expense statement for the most recently completed fiscal year, and we're looking for the organization's budget for the current fiscal year. And on the program financial side, for each program that is applied for, we're looking for the program revenue and expense statement for the most recently completed fiscal year, the program budget for the current fiscal year, and a program in-kind contribution summary, if that's applicable. Again, and that would be for the most recently completed fiscal year. That in-kind contribution summary is required if an organization is claiming in-kind support as part of their program revenues, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And just to note, our website has examples of all of these financial documents that have been mentioned here, so they're a really great resource if you're not quite sure what that should look like, or maybe it's been raised in a past letter that something is amiss and you want to take a look at what we're expecting to see. So back to this in-kind contribution. So organizations can include in-kind support or contributions as part of their program financials. It's a really great way to not only show that community support and investment, but these contributions can also be a way to show greater program revenue and expenses and support your request for funding. Also, if organizations are finding that government funding is making up a large portion of their program revenue, that might put them over that 75% government funding limit for programs. This can also be really helpful to include because that in-kind support can be used to contribute toward the remaining 25% of a program's operating costs. So for groups that don't have a lot of other funding sources, this can actually be really helpful. So in-kind support can include any combination of volunteer time, maybe donated labor, equipment, services or materials from other third-party sources over the past 12 months. So the valuation of volunteerism and donation follows these following standards for our program. So for donated materials, they would be valued at verified fair market value. Any donated accredited professional services, so things like maybe an accountant, they would also be valued at verified fair market value. And volunteer labor is valued at $20 an hour for our program. And just to note that that volunteer hourly rate is just for the purpose of calculating in-kind volunteer contributions in grant applications for this specific program. So we don't necessarily suggest that you use that for other things. It's just how we count it for our program. And if you include any in-kind contributions in your program financials, it should be listed as both a revenue and expense on your program financials so that they total to zero, because otherwise it would be showing that you maybe had an expense or a revenue where that didn't exist. So the information on your program's in-kind support must be submitted using our in-kind contribution summary, which can be found on our website. And this helps us to determine the eligible costs, so those costs related to the program delivery. And like everything, complete records of all the volunteered hours and donated services or materials should be retained as part of your organization's gaming records. So I mentioned I'd talk a little about the timelines, because when you start talking about current and past fiscal years, depending on where you're at in your current fiscal year in terms of the calendar year, but also your sector's intake window, it can get a little confusing. So I have a couple examples here that will hopefully help just spell that out a little bit more. So the example that we're looking at here, we're taking an arts and culture intake. So their sector was open from February 1st to April 30th. And in this example, the organization's fiscal year is the same as the calendar year, so January 1st to December 31st. And in this case, the organization has decided to apply on April 1st of 2020. So what that would mean then is that the organization and program actuals, the revenue and expense statement, would be covering the previous fiscal year, which was January 1st to December 31st of 2020. You can see that on the screen here. And then the budget for both the organization and the program would be for the fiscal year that we are currently in, which would be from January 1st to December 31st of 2021. And the budget should demonstrate how the grant would be spent in this period. Funding can be spent up to 12 months from when the funding was received. And funding can also be used for costs that were incurred in the same fiscal year as the grant was received. So for example, they applied on April 1st and they were awarded funding on May 1st. So organizations could spend their funding from May 1st of 2022, or sorry, May 1st of 2021 till May 1st of 2022, or they can reimburse for costs that were incurred between January 1st, the start of their fiscal year, and May 1st, which is when they received the grant. So we'll run through another example here. So this is using a different fiscal year, which is quite a common one for most. So the fiscal year in this case is April 1st to March 31st. The organization has applied, same as last example, on April 1st. So the organization and program actuals for April 1st, or would be for April 1st, 2020 to March 31st of 2021. Obviously, the fiscal year has just closed literally a day ago, but because it is the most recently complete, this is the reference year required. So for both this and the previous example, sometimes those financials, finalized financials are not ready or available. So organizations can submit internal or draft financials in that case. Or, you could wait a couple weeks to apply when those would be available. And then for the program budget, that would be for the period of April 1st, 2021 to March of 2022, as that would be the current fiscal year. I have one more example. So again, we're using the same fiscal year of April 1st to March 31st, but in this case, the applicant has decided to apply a bit earlier. So they're applying March 1st of 2021. So that would mean that the organization and program actuals would be for the period of April 1st, 2019 to March 31st of 2020, as that is the most recently completed year, because at the time of applying, you're still in that 2020-2021 fiscal year, which ends at the end of that month. And then for the budget, ideally, this would be for April 1st of 2021 to March 2022. Although you're still in the current 2020-2021 fiscal year, there's really only 1 month left. So assuming you intend to spend the grant for future expenses, the budget should show that future budget. Again, with all of this, you can consider the timing if your fiscal year kind of is at an awkward time in terms of when your sector intake period is. That's why we have a bigger window to apply. So for the HSS sector, or Human and Social Services, there's a 6-month window that you can time that a bit more strategically for yourself. There's 2 months for Environment and Public Safety. And then for everyone else, there's a 3-month window to apply. So you can kind of figure out what makes the most sense for your organization in terms of the financial documents that you have available. Okay, so now I'll talk a bit about spending the grant. So as I've been saying throughout, the grant funds are really intended for supporting that program delivery. So grant funds can cover costs that are essential to the direct delivery of an approved program. This can include things like wages of existing paid positions, rent, utilities, and insurance that's associated with the program, any program supplies, office supplies, internet or phone costs, or program advertising. If you need to rent or purchase equipment that's needed for the direct delivery of the program. We also allow travel that's essential to the direct delivery of the program within BC. And we also have allowed out-of-province travel, but that has a sort of separate approval process, and obviously none of that has been happening lately, but hopefully things will get back to normal in that regard. So an organization can allocate a percentage of their core operating costs, things like wages, rent, utility, supplies, toward their program if the costs are directly related to the program delivery. So I think I have a couple examples of that. This example here, we've got an employee that spends 40% of their time working on an eligible program, which is a museum display, and the other 60% of their time they're working on non-eligible programming or organizational duties. So maybe they've got a gift shop, they do a bit of grant writing and board work. So in this case, you would be able to include 40% of the employee's wage as a program expense. So in that program financials, you would show a prorated amount. Here is another example of what that would look like if you had multiple programs where that expense was spread across all of them. So in this example, we've got an organization's director who spends time on 4 programs in addition to organizational core duties. And 3 of these are approved programs. The director spends an equal amount of time on all 5 activities. So 20% of their time is spread across each of these kind of 5 buckets. So therefore, 20% of the director's wage could be included as an expense in each of the program budgets. And the same principle here applies to other core costs, like I mentioned, rent, utilities, wages, advertising, and so on. And organizations can determine on what basis to prorate costs. Obviously, it depends on the nature of the expense. So something like program hours might be helpful if you're trying to sort out how to prorate wages, or if you're trying to figure out how to sort of allocate the different, the rent. You could look at it in terms of the proportion of the physical space that you maybe rent out, or other relevant factors, depending on what that item is. Also, organizations can apply for funding for minor capital projects or capital acquisitions as part of your normal community gaming grant application. So for minor capital projects, organizations can apply for funding for capital projects under $20,000. They must be essential for the delivery of an approved program. So it would need to be demonstrated why that was basically needed for them to continue doing what they're doing. Things like that we've seen that we've approved would be things like wheelchair ramps or small renovations needed in order to continue delivering the program. And as I mentioned, we also fund capital acquisitions. And again, this would be for something that's required to deliver the approved program. We do require quotes if the item is over $5,000. And in the past, that has included things like computers, other specialized equipment that's specific to the program, and also vehicles. And just to note that organizations cannot apply for minor capital projects or capital acquisitions only. It has to be part of a program application. So that request for either a minor capital project or acquisition would be included as part of the funding request for one of your programs. So organizations must have a separate account for receiving, holding, and dispersing the gaming funds, as the grant funds are deposited into this gaming account. So all eligible expenses should be paid directly from the gaming account wherever possible. Grant funds can be transferred either by check or electronically from the gaming account to the general account to reimburse eligible program expenses. But as I said, the sort of cleanest way to keep that record is if you're able to pay directly from your gaming account. You can pay by check or by board approved electronic transfer, and invoices and receipts must be retained for 5 years as part of your gaming records. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but grant funds must be spent within 12 months from when the funding was received. Funding can be used for costs incurred in the same fiscal year that the grant was received as well. So, for example, if your organization's fiscal year was from the calendar year, January 1st to December 31st of 2021, and you received a grant on April 1st of 2021, you could either spend your grant forward until April 1st of 2022, or you could spend it backwards to the beginning of your fiscal year, which started on January 1st. So costs that were incurred between January 1st and April 1st of that fiscal year could be back paid or reimbursed. So all gaming grant spending must be reported in the Gaming Account Summary Report, otherwise known as the GASR. All organizations that receive grants or have previously received a grant and still have money in their gaming account must submit a GASR every year. And that must be submitted within 90 days of the organization's fiscal year end. The GASR includes details on your gaming account balance at the beginning of the fiscal year, any grant funds that you've received that year, what funds you've dispersed and what you've spent it on, and the balance at the end of the fiscal year. And there's also a section to describe how the community benefited from the programs and services that were supported through your gaming grant funds for the year. And important to note that organizations must submit all of their recent gaming account summary reports in order to receive another gaming grant or capital project grant. So if it's outstanding, you really want to make sure you rectify that. And this is kind of our only big reporting for our program, and that helps to ensure that grant funding is only used on eligible expenses. We have a blank gaming account summary report, as well as an example filled in gaming account summary report on our website if you're in need of either of those. Okay, so now we'll talk about applying for the grant. So as I mentioned, we have all of our different sectors, and pretty much all of them have their own intake and notification dates. So arts and culture and sport have already come and gone. The PACs and DPAC is open until June 30th, so they're done as well for the year. So the ones that are open right now, we've got Human and Social Services, that will be open until November 30th, and all organizations should expect to receive a notification by February 28th. Actually, it should say 2022. And environment and public safety will be opening, or has opened, I guess we're in July now, and that'll be open until August 31st. And in both instances, they should receive notification by November 30th. And we also have our separate $5 million capital project grant stream that'll be open till the end of this month. And we've got our notification as November 1st there, but we're saying sometime in the fall. It could be by November 1st, but sometimes it depends because all of those applications are reviewed at once. So, and we'll talk about that in a second too. Okay, so when you go to apply, you'll do this online through our website. Paper applications are not accepted. This is all done online. If there are any documents that need to be included, they can be attached to the application itself through an upload, or they can be emailed after the fact, and you have 2 weeks after you apply to submit those by email. Before you apply, again, review those program guidelines. It's really important. We also have a lot of resources on our website that are helpful. So we've got pre-application checklists to make sure you have everything you need. We've got sample financial statements if you want to check out the format that those should be submitted in. We've got frequently asked questions as well as application tutorials. If your application is denied or you'd like to request that the branch reconsiders their decision, you can file a reconsideration request. That must be made within 30 days of receiving your notification letter, and it must state the reasons why the decision should be varied or overturned. And something that's important about this whole process is that new information, documents, etc., are not accepted. This is really just another look at the entire application to make sure that no errors were made in the original assessment. And a final decision will be made within 90 days of receiving that request. So just some final tips and advice for applying. I don't think anything new here. I've been saying it throughout, but just so it's all in one place. Starting with reading the most recent program guidelines, reviewing the pre-application checklist to make sure you've got everything you need before you go to apply, and reviewing those example documents on our website. If you can, if it's possible or relevant to you, you could have a professional review your financials. And making sure that all your required documentation is saved as a Word or PDF for easy upload at the time of application. If you do have questions, we have someone on our phone line every day if you want to shoot them a phone call and get a quick answer. If relevant, you would be wise to address any items from your previous notification letter if anything was raised. And you can attach a cover letter with your application if you think that might be helpful. Make sure your gaming account summary reports have been submitted. And then finally, applying earlier in the intake period is always helpful as we do assess the applications in the order that they are received. Okay, so that takes care of the community gaming grants program. So I'm going to talk for a few more minutes about the capital projects grant program for 2021. So 2021 is the 5th year that this program has been in place. The objective of this grant is to enable not-for-profits to complete capital projects that will provide a significant benefit to their communities. This program is specifically for capital projects with a total cost between $20,000 to $1.25 million. We are strict on that amount, and the reason is that we're looking for projects that are really within the scope of a not-for-profit organization. So we're not looking to fund mega projects that really may be better suited to some other kind of infrastructure program. The sectors for the main community gaming grant program also apply here. So the grants would also need to fall under one of the 6 sectors. The organization eligibility is the same as the regular community gaming grant program. And for this program, we would fund between 20 to 50% of a total cost of the project. The percentage really depends on the cost of the project and the grant amount, and I'll give an example in a second. We provide grants up to a maximum of $250,000. So for example, if your project total budget was $1.25 million and we would be providing a maximum of $250,000, that would equal 20% of the funding. So you can kind of see how the funding proportion changes depending on the total cost of your project. So matching funds from the applicant organization are required for this program, and they must be on hand at the time of your application. You can provide things like a bona fide commitment that might be contingent on a successful application, but I will say that funding in hand is a stronger case for your application as it provides more certainty. Successful applicants will get what they've applied for, assuming that they've met all the requirements. And last but not least, the assessment process for this grant is different than the community gaming grants in that it is competitive. So applicants are encouraged to put forward their strongest application, just knowing that other groups are doing the same thing. So the intake for the capital project grant, as I mentioned, runs from June 1st to July 31st of this year. We expect to notify successful and unsuccessful organizations by late fall. Organizations can only submit one application per year for only one project. So you couldn't apply for several different projects or phases of projects, just one complete project. There should only be one lead in the application and subsequently the project. Organizations can work with other organizations or get their support, but there needs to be just one entity that has responsibility for this, and it needs to be clear in the application who that is, and that would be obviously the applicant. Organizations can still apply for their regular community gaming grant. These two programs are considered separate from each other. And like our regular guidelines, the Capital Project Program has its own sector guide, which is updated each year and can be found on our website. So we have project eligibility criteria for this program. As I mentioned, we only accept one grant application per applicant and only one project per grant. So applicants can apply for only one of these project categories. So you can apply for a bunch of building renovations, but you couldn't also apply for acquisitions like vehicles and other equipment. So organizations need to pick one project that they want to complete. Because as I said, what we really want to see is the successful completion of a total project, not a half completed handful of projects. So the three project categories we have, there's facilities. So that would be constructing new facilities, renovating or maintaining existing facilities. That would include things like purchasing new or used buildings, constructing a community or childcare facility, doing interior or exterior renovations, maybe installing an HVAC system or elevators, things like that. Community infrastructure is about public amenities and developing public amenities that improve BC residents' quality of life and is accessible to the public. So things under that category in the past have been things like playgrounds or outdoor structures, skate parks, hiking and walking trails, public wharfs, and ecosystem restoration. And finally, acquisition. So that would be the purchase of fixed capital assets for long-term ownership and use by the applicant organization. That would include things like vehicles, computer systems, technical equipment, audiovisual equipment, sports equipment, and even boats. So, so that gives an idea of what we will fund. What we don't fund is research or development. This program is really about funding those hard assets. Each project category has its own eligibility criteria, but generally speaking, they're focused on things like ensuring the project is for community benefit and accessible to the public after they've been completed, and that the organization has the right to build or modify land if it's the top two of those categories. So they would need to show proof of ownership, lease, or some kind of permission. So as I mentioned, this is a competitively scored grant. So I'll just go through some of the different areas that we score an application. In order to have the project scored, the applicant must meet all those eligibility criteria. So there would be the organization eligibility that I mentioned, the project eligibility, and financial eligibility, which for this program is really just about supplying the same program financials as you would for a community gaming grant. Projects or applications that are able to meet those eligibility criteria would then go on to be scored against the assessment criteria. So here's a bit of a breakdown of how we assess the applications. So the community benefit piece is worth 20%, and we're looking to see in the applicant's words why the project is needed and how the community would benefit. We have a small portion allocated to inclusiveness and accessibility. So applications would be scored on how many people will benefit and ensuring that it's open and inclusive to everyone. 25% is allocated to project feasibility. So basically what we're looking for is to see that there's a sound plan in place to ensure that the project is going to be able to start after funding is provided and then it's going to be able to be completed on time. So for successful applicants, the funding must be fully spent within 36 months of receiving it. So the project timeline should show how the project would be completed within that time frame. And the other piece to note on timing is that the project has to start within 12 months of receiving the funding. The biggest category is financial considerations. So not only do we want to see that there's a viable plan in place to execute the project, but we want to see those solid numbers on the financial aspect of the project. So here we're assessing the project's total cost and budget, how the grant funds will be used toward eligible expenses, and that those matching funds are in place. So finally, we have a small portion again allocated to environmental efficiency, and that would cover things like climate or environment features to reduce energy or operational costs or emissions. This might not be applicable to all projects, and applicants can certainly note when this is not applicable and why. And so once all the applications have been scored and ranked, additional considerations may be applied. And that would be things like making sure funding is distributed across all the sectors, all the regions in BC, and making sure that any Indigenous organizations, projects also have that consideration too. Okay, so now we're nearing the end. I'll just leave off with some resources if you want to pursue things on your own or you want to get in touch. I've mentioned our website a couple times, so this is the web address, or you can just Google community gaming grants and it should also bring you there. We have a general email as well as that phone line that I mentioned that is staffed by someone every day. There's also a separate inbox for the community outreach manager, which is myself, but it's also monitored by our policy analyst, Amy. So both of those email addresses are up there for you. BCACG, who is kindly hosting this session for us, is also available to help. And for those of you who might not be aware, they are a provincial not-for-profit organization that really liaises between community groups and the community gaming grants branch. We do provide a bit of funding to this organization, to BCACG, to provide those support services to charities and not-for-profits, specifically for the purpose of applying for the community gaming grant program. So if you need help with an application, they are there to support you. Similarly, the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres is also available to help organizations, more specifically to provide support to Indigenous not-for-profits. And then finally, there are several community charitable gaming associations throughout the province, and they're a bit more regionally focused on not-for-profits that are within their community, but they provide support to their local charities and community groups, similar to the BCACG, to help them with their applications and answer questions and things like that.
At this point, I would just like to thank Denise again, and so everybody can have 15 minutes of that time back and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. So thank you very much, Denise.
Thanks, Kalina, and thanks for everyone who spent their afternoon with us.